assault. Genesis 19. David's heart smote him after he had numbered the people. David said to the Lord, I have sinned greatly in what I have done. So the Lord sent a pestilence upon Israel. From 2 Samuel 24. Our intelligence, as it leaves the hands of nature, has for its chief object the unorganized solid. With this continuous alone does the intellect form a clear idea. Of immobility alone does the intellect form a clear idea. The intellect lets what is new in each moment of history escape. It does not admit the unforeseeable. It rejects all creation. The intellect is characterized by a natural inability to comprehend life. But it is to the very inwardness of life that intuition leads us. By intuition, I mean instinct that has become disinterested, self-conscious, capable of reflecting upon its object and of enlarging it indefinitely. From Henri Bergson, Creative Evolution. So, welcome back, dear friends, to our discussion of Letter 18, The Moon, from Valentin Tomberg's Meditations on the Tarot. And this one, like Letter 9, it's a little, I wouldn't say obscure, but it's a little bit more difficult to penetrate than most of the letters, even though they all have their challenges. But this one is particularly murky, and I wonder if that has something to do with the subject itself, with the impenetrability of this lunar darkness that's discussed here, this moving backward, this inability to see creativity. So it's almost performative of that. So it's interesting. And as Tomberg says on the first page, relates to the problem of inversion of the forward movement of life, the problem of retrograde movement. It is the problem of retrograde movement, contrary to that of life, which is suggested spontaneously by the card of the 18th major arcanum of the tarot. Right? So, after this light-filled meditation, contemplation of the star, here we get into this murkiness. And interestingly enough, it's just coincidental, last night, I live out in the country, as you can expect, and one of my dogs woke me up at 4 a.m, and I didn't know she wanted to go outside. So I let her out, and it was full moon, and across the road from us is a big meadow surrounded on 3 sides by forest. And you could hear the coyotes howling at the moon, and the dogs, even the dog we keep outside, our guard dog, he was annoyed and wanted to get into it. He howled. He's really quiet usually, but and then this morning, preparing for this discussion, this lecture, reading about the moon again. So interesting phenomenon. And of course, we see on the card the dog and the wolf howling at the moon, right? This retrograde movement. And he calls this what's depicted in this card is the agent of diminution, the principle of the eclipse. It will be present and active in us even if the devil and all demons resigned, and even if all human beings learnt the lesson of humility and abandoned the desire to build towers of Babel. Right? And as we know, Tomberg, his emphasis in this letter is on the intellect and intelligence. The limits of the intellect and intelligence in particular. And in our culture, we place a lot of emphasis on the intelligence and cleverness. And as Tomberg points out, conscience. Where is conscience in this discussion of intelligence, of rationality? Where is the the desire to do the good. And here I'll read on page 495 what he says. Now, human consciousness is the field where three kinds of light are manifest: creative light, reflected light, and revealed light. The first participates in the work of the creation of the world, such as it has continued since the sixth day of creation, which we now call creative evolution. And of course, he's drawing a lot on Bergson in his letter, probably astoundingly, to an astounding level. The second illumines the dark field of action of the human will, which we now call matter. The last orientates us towards transcendent values and truths, which constitute, as it were, the supreme court of appeal, the ultimate criterion of all that is worth and of all that is true in space and in time. And a little bit later he says, creative consciousness, reflecting intelligence and revelation from above, are the three lights of the human microcosm: its sun, moon, and stars. Of course, this is the reverse order of these three cards in the tarot that we're discussing, right? The sun, the moon, and the stars. We start with the stars, the moon, and the sun. Now, also, I think it's worth mentioning that in a lot of fairy tales, the hero will traverse through the world of the sun, or the world of the moon, or the world of the stars. It's an interesting sidelight, I suppose. And sometimes they'll say it in the golden world, in the silver world, or in the world of the diamonds. So it takes different forms, but it's an interesting a notion, and also kind of the implicit cosmology found in fairy tales, and found in Hermeticism, and as we're talking right now. Now, Tomberg contrasts two lines of thought here on page 497. He contrasts Solomon's thinking from Ecclesiastes, that what has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done, and there is nothing new under the sun. Right? So all that we discover, it's already been done. And then, on the other hand, he contrasts that with a passage from Bergson's Creative Evolution, which I'll read here. The universe endures. The more we study the nature of time, the more we shall comprehend that duration means invention, the creation of forms, the continual elaboration of the absolutely new. Now, it's interesting that this is what Tomberg sees as the salvation of the sciences. If it were to do this, if we were to take on this creative approach, or creative insight, creative intuition, but it doesn't. And science studies what is, and as Tomberg points out, it looks at autumn, it looks at the harvest, but doesn't look at the springtime, which is always already happening. Which is, and you would think that science might be interested in, especially in thinking of evolution, of seeing where it's going, but it doesn't seem to be the case. There are probably some corners of the scientific literature I'm unfamiliar with, but it doesn't seem that they're looking at where science is going, other than in transhumanism. Transhumanism, they're trying to anticipate the next logical step of evolution, which for them includes the incorporation of computer and information technology into the human person, which I disagree. I don't think that's a good move. But even straight up evolutionary biologists, they're more concerned about the harvest right now and going backward rather than going forward. And I think, even though there may be examples of this, but I think the criticism from creation scientists, not that I have a lot of respect for creation science, is that when science talks about evolution and talks about kind of intermediary species, like, for instance, when the transition from birds reptiles or reptiles to birds. We don't have any half bird, half reptiles out. So where are our transitional species now? Creation science asks. Now there might be some that I don't know about, but it's still worth considering. Where is the creativity? And I think we do dwell in, certainly in our education, we do dwell on now is the harvest and everything behind. We never look at the spring or even the spring that's currently happening. And what Tomberg's trying to draw our attention to is here we see the limits of the intellect, right? Or we talked about Wordsworth before. We murder to dissect, right? So we cease to see what's living. And on also on page 497, he says right here, he says, for the arcanum, the moon, insofar as it is a spiritual exercise, has no other aim than to evoke the conscious desire to go further than intelligence and decide to make a leap in order to leave its sphere. Right? And a little bit later, he talks about, the medieval notion of philosophy as the handmaid of theology. But that's, that we don't think about that anymore. But how do we leave it behind? And this is what I wrote about in my book, The Submerged Reality, a book on sophiology, which is subtitled Sophiology and the Turn to a Poetic Metaphysics, because that's my feeling now, and it was when as I was writing the book, is that the intellect only brings us so far, and we need to, as Tomberg says, leap into a poetic perception, and when I say poetic perception, I do not mean metaphorical. I mean, as we talked last time about the poet as the unacknowledged legislator of the world perception, and a new way of seeing, a higher way of seeing. And so, and so this is one of his themes here, is how do we get beyond this intellect, this notion of being, at the apex. It's almost kind of scientific or humanistic hubris, as we are at the apex right now, and there's no place, we can't really proceed from here. This is it. This is as far as we'll go. And in this regard, he criticizes both the some scientific methods and the methods of some occultists who, he says, try to be scientists. On page 500, he says, not only science decomposes, that is, objects into chemical substances, the latter into molecules, molecules into atoms, and atoms into electrons, but also occult science, which would like to equal official science, decomposes. For example, the human being is decomposed into 3 principles, spirit, soul, and body, when it is a matter of the place that man occupies between God and nature, or into 4 principles, physical body, vital body, astral body, and ego, when it is a matter of the practical task of mastership by the operant of his instruments, as in the case of Raja Yoga. And then sometimes it's 7 principles, sometimes it's 9, sometimes it's 12. Right? And if we add here, he says, also the Christian theology divides man into only 2 principles, body and soul, that the Vedanta and the Kabbalah divide him into 5 principles, etc., etc., it becomes evident that man easily allows himself diverse modes of decomposition, according to the aims of the intelligence which applies them. But he admits of this operation only insofar as he is given over to the manipulation of intelligence, which treat him in the way proper to it, that is, which decompose him according to a system corresponding in the best possible way to the ends that the will is aiming at. Because intelligence, even when it is engaged in occult science, clearly represents to itself only the discontinuous. Right? And so here's the thing, there's got to be another way of knowing. There must be another way of knowing, because simply the intelligence is a dead end. And I think we see that even though, medicine and science discovers all kinds of interesting things, its method is a dead end, because it doesn't have that that leap. And from here, Tomberg draws us into a consideration of the Gospel of St. John, in particular the prologue of St. John's Gospel, as the anti dead end of intelligence, of the springtime. So, and he says on page 502, for instance, the Gospel of St. John invites us from the outset to an unparalleled act of violence to our intelligence, in transposing from autumn, where it is at home, to full springtime, from the harvest to the sowing, from things made to the creative word, from vivified things to life itself, from illumined things to light itself. Right? This is, and he gets into a kind of an extended, I shouldn't say extended, but a little bit of a meditation on how important that in the prologue to that gospel is. In principio erat verbum. And he says, here is the difference between the nature of intelligence and that of intuition, of faith, between the principle of autumn and that of spring. The former is understanding of that which is, the latter is participation in the becoming of that which is to be. Right? Now, as we said before, we're not going to, and he says later, when he gives some examples of the psychologist and the spiritualist, you don't want to, you can't say, I'm totally getting rid of the intellect. We use the intellect. In my book, The Submerged Reality, I use all kinds of intellect to put that book together. But, it only leads you so far. And then you have to transcend it. And this is what Tomberg's talking about, and it's what Hermeticism is. And he said this is what Hermeticism is concerned with, right? And an alliance of intelligence and the intuition of faith. The alchemical marriage of the moon and the sun, right? And he sees evidence of this in lots of people. He talks about them a little bit. He sees it, of course, in Thomas Aquinas and Bergson and Father Teilhard. And he says, whether we like it or not, we are engaged in this way forever, even if it were only a matter of mirage. Right? We need this. Goes back to the idea of the union of opposites, the marriage of opposites. Right? We need these things. We can't do without the intellect, but we can't turn it into an idol either. And he says here on page 503, intelligence and the intuition of faith already act as an engaged couple, but not yet as a married couple. There has been no complete success in obtaining the alloy of these two metals. It is always either silvered gold or gilded silver. And this is one of my favorite parts of the book, I think. Because I've thought about it a lot over the years. I'm not exactly sure in the last what he's talking about, but I get a sense for it. And I kind of don't want to come up with a definition. But what he says here, giving examples. With Thomas Aquinas, for example, it is silvered gold. With most occultist authors, it is gilded silver. Origen, Dionysius the Areopagite, Jacob Boehme, Louis-Claude de Saint-Martin, Vladimir Soloviev and Nicholas Berdyaev, for example, show in their works a progress which is very advanced in substantially bringing together intelligence and the intuition of faith. The same could be said for Henri Bergson and Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. So I actually encourage people to read all of these authors, and one of them actually probably not a lot of people read anymore, and I think he should be read. He's a very important philosopher is the Russian philosopher Nicholas Berdyaev. We talked about it a little bit before, but he's a great radical philosopher, and he's very much of a hermetic soul, you could say, because he's not satisfied with accepting everything that's been handed to us and turning philosophy into kind of regurgitation of what other philosophers have said. For him, philosophy is an activity, which we do now. And because his philosophy is, it's a religious philosophy, but he's almost a disciple of Jacob Boehme, and he knows a lot of occultism, and he's not afraid to examine these different schools of thought and to like Tomberg to take what is of value and not worry about what he can't use and move forward. So it's really a creative kind of philosophy. And in fact, I think I quoted from his book, The Meaning of the Creative Act, before. So I highly recommend you investigating his thought. And from here, Tomberg gives kind of a program, I guess we could say, in the practical task of this endeavor. And on page 504, here's what he says. Here's the practical task of this endeavor. It envisages rendering the instincts disinterested. That is the aim of all asceticism, or that part of the way towards mystical union that tradition calls the via purgativa, the way of purification of the spiritual disciple, or also purgatory, when it is a matter of the way of human destiny. Then it envisages instinct becoming conscious of itself, that is, what the tradition calls the via illuminativa, the way of illumination of the spiritual disciple, also caelum, heaven, when it is a matter of the way of human destiny. And then, lastly, it envisages instinct becoming capable of reflecting upon its object and expanding indefinitely, whilst becoming completely united to it through sympathy, what tradition calls the via unitiva, the way of union. Right? The fruits of the way of union are gnosis and the mysticism of contemplation, or also the visio beatifica, the beatific vision, which human souls enjoy in heaven after purgatory and after the celestial school, in which they learn not to be dazzled by the divine light, but rather to see through it, when it is a matter of the way of human destiny. Right? And he says, well, and how is this to be realized? He says, it consists of the enterprise of going out of intelligence from its milieu. And I would also suggest, as I have before, that what he's also kind of describing is the phenomenological method right here, right? Rendering the instincts disinterested. So the first step in phenomenology is to bracket one's assumptions or passions, hate, love, whatever it is about a certain thing, and try to bracket all that as you behold the phenomenon. Right? And then that's the purgation. That's the rendering the instincts disinterested, or asceticism, right? You take yourself out of it. Right? You forget about everything they told you in philosophy class or theology class and just shut up and listen. And then the next thing is, when he says it envisages instinct becoming conscious of itself, the illumination, this is when we let the phenomenon speak to us. When we listen, we actually hear it speaking to us. And the last step is the way of union. Now, this is not going to happen with everything with which we engage in the phenomenological reduction. But as I've written about this a couple times in my book, The Incarnation of the Poetic Word, that there are times when we contemplate certain things, I think in the arts in particular, but it happens in liturgy, that if we are in a state of openness that is made possible through a phenomenological reduction, and we get to the point of union with the phenomenon where we allow it to speak to us, then sometimes union happens. We have a moment of connection not only with the author of the work, if it's a poem or a creative work of music or artwork, but that sometimes, not all the time, God speaks to us through this. Sophia speaks to us as well. And I may have mentioned this before, but an example of that is in the Sistine Madonna. So many people have had these kind of deeply moving religious experiences through the Sistine Madonna. Rudolf Steiner makes quite a big deal about it in certain of his lectures. But Sergei Bulgakov, the Russian Orthodox theologian and priest, before he became a priest, before he even returned to Christianity, he would go to the gallery in Dresden where the Sistine Madonna was on display and just weep, just being present before the mother. I think this is one of the seeds of his Sophiology. But likewise, Novalis, the Romantic poet, he was also deeply inspired by the Sistine Madonna, and it shows up in his poem Hymns to the Night. So, and there are others as well, but it's kind of it would be interesting to do a kind of mystical history of the Sistine Madonna. The people who have had these deep experiences with it. So that's a good thing for us to do, right? And then he gets into this long quote from Bergson, which, to be short, Bergson is saying, you got to take a risk, right? And that's what Tomberg prefaces it with, right? Going out of intelligence, the enterprise of going out of intelligence from its milieu. How do we do that? Also, if you ever can find it, there's an interesting, not fantastic, but it's got some good stuff in it, documentary called Being in the World. It's about phenomenology. But interestingly, though, they don't talk a lot. They talk a lot about philosophy, but not like the way you would think. They draw on Heideggerian philosophy, which is about how do we interact with things in the world. And we have this experience of an opening when, say, you're a musician or an athlete. People who practice a lot at their craft, at first there's a lot of intellect involved, right? You're kind of trying to learn the notes and trying to study it and do a lot of intellectual work with it. But you get to the point where you go beyond it. You go beyond the thought process that's involved, and you enter into I would say, the being of the work. Or if it's a athletic event, you enter into the being of football, or being of soccer, or whatever it happens to be. You really enter into it, and that's where new things are explored in each of those domains. And then that film, being in the World, they give some really interesting examples from music, jazz as well as flamenco, but also from athletes, juggler, cooking. All these things that we these are the moments that impart value to our lives, and they are openings, ultimately, to the divine. But even in between, the way of purgation and the way of union, you do have these moments of illumination. And in fact, as a musician, when I get together and play with my friends, we talk about sometimes you get into this place where you're playing and nobody's ever even thinking about what you're doing anymore, and you're just responding to what all the other musicians are like, and time disappears. And my friends and I used to joke around and call it mysticism. That's kind of what it is. Kind of it's religious without being religious. That's something Jacques Derrida would say. It's religious without being religious. And from here, this is probably one of the more dense sections in the letter, is when Tomberg does a lot of work with the tree of life in the Kabbalah, right? And I'm not going to go through the whole thing because it can be very, very technical. For people who aren't familiar with the Kabbalah, it might get confusing because there's a lot there. It's a rich source of meditation. But the long and the short of it is the Kabbalah, in the polarities between the pillar of mercy and the pillar of severity, you have two possibilities, I guess you could say, for synthesis. There's a higher synthesis, a lower synthesis, but they're syntheses. And the one he's not worried about here, the one he's concerned with here is the one between Hokmah, or wisdom, and Bina, intelligence, and their synthesis is Da'at, knowledge, which does not appear on the tree of life. We often call it one of the hidden paths. And he says on page 507, it's precisely the act of knowledge which is in question the case of Da'at, which is the aim of the spiritual school of the Kabbalah. Right? It's the union of intelligence and wisdom, which is what he's getting at in this letter. We have the intelligence, right? But it only goes so far. And wisdom, and of course, what's wisdom code for? Sophia. So, worth meditating on. I mean, if you know the Kabbalah at all, it might be even a richer source for you to explore. I mean, I look at these diagrams, I just want to get lost in all these little pathways between the different Sephiroth, but I'm resisting the temptation. But I do want to draw your attention to something on page 510. Right, and this is important. Remember, Tom Burke didn't even start writing this book till he was in his 60s. Right? And he says all this work, the great work in which the Hermeticist is engaged, he says, but this takes place only after the more or less long and painful experience of the crucifixion of consciousness on the cross formed by the pair of opposites, subjectivity, objectivity, and the pair of opposites, intelligence, unconscious, wisdom. Right? The only way to come to this marriage of opposites is through the crucifixion on the cross formed by a pair of opposites, subjectivity, objectivity, intelligence, unconscious wisdom. And when he says painful, he's not fooling around. This is a hard thing to come to. I mean, it takes. Well, I think it also. I wonder. I don't know if it could happen. Can it really happen before the age? And this is what they used to say with the Kabbalah, that you shouldn't study the Kabbalah till you're 40. Because this coming to this. Steiner would say, until after consciousness soul. Intellectual soul, according to Steiner's paradigm, is characterizes a person up to 35, where it's a very figuring things out. You got to come up with a system. But after that is consciousness soul, which is this really a struggle. I would call it the wandering in the desert, until you come to a little bit later, after the age of 40, when you can come to a deeper understanding. I mean, just you can. I'm not saying you can't before that, but I think it's probably a little easier after a certain age. I'm not trying to discourage anybody either. And he says here on page 511, it is this cross where the gradual approach, alliance, and lastly union of intelligence and unconscious wisdom is effected. Now he said gradual. Takes time. Right? I read this book first, 30 years ago. Almost, 30 years ago. I've been working with it ever since. I still don't, I'm still working with it. At the beginning of this process, intelligence and unconscious wisdom have so little in common that communication between them is reduced almost entirely to dreams. That is, to the state of consciousness where intelligence, although present, is most passive. Then this communication is extended to the waking state also. The language of communication then becomes that of symbols, including those of the tarot. Lastly, intelligence and wisdom, no longer unconscious, arrive at such a degree of mutual comprehension that they understand directly without the intermediary of dreams and symbols. It is only then their union is achieved. That is, that the state of consciousness that Bergson calls intuition, and that the Kabbalists identify with Da'at, is attained. And I think if there's an aid I know of in achieving this, it would be an engagement with the arts. To become an artist doesn't mean to become a professional, but become an artist. Whether it's poetry or painting or music, because you will get to this place where you understand what he's talking about. And I think it's probably more difficult if one exists in a purely intellectual domain. Though it's possible. I think Heidegger did it. But to become an artist as well. And it could be gardening. We could include gardening as an art. Right? Becoming involved with the world of things. And those things could be words. Those things could be plants. Could be musical notes, could be a musical instrument, right? Made of metal and wood and whatever else it's made from, right? And then he says that what this is simply the development of conscience, right? We're uniting intelligence and wisdom. It's just conscience. And he says conscience has two aspects: a negative aspect, which manifests itself as warning, disapproving an action before its execution, or else as remorse, disapproving of an action after it's committed, and a positive aspect, which manifests itself as an impulse recommending an action before its execution and as serene joy after its execution, right? Conscience offers intelligence as vast a world of inner experience as does the empirical world for our outer experience. Intelligence can therefore develop itself and grow in two directions simultaneously: in the direction of outer empirical world, thanks to the senses, and in that of the inner empirical world, thanks to conscience. And I think the arts aid in that tremendously. And this is where he says, this way intelligence can become the servant of conscience. Right? Just as in the Middle Ages, philosophy was the Ancilla Theologiae, which is the handmaid of theology. And then he does an interesting move here, where he connects this to the guardian of the threshold. Now, you might not know about the guardian of the threshold. It's this idea in Western esotericism. Steiner talks quite a bit about it, I'm sure. That's to a profound degree. That's what Tomberg is drawing on here. The guardian at the threshold, now there's two ways of thinking about it, which Tomberg gives us, is one, it's kind of our unredeemed qualities. This is what Jung would call the shadow, our confrontation with the shadow, the part we don't like. So it's psychotherapy, this is what you confront, right? But to become honest about yourself. How about you can be a jerk, and how you can be mean or callous or unfeeling toward people, or and those are not the things we like to think. We'd like to think, well, I'm really nice and people like me. Gosh darn it, people like me. But the guardian of the threshold, so there's that aspect to it. And Steiner talks about how the first time you encounter the guardian, it's terrifying and ugly. And then you see a little bit of this in Buddhist psychology, especially in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, right? The things you confront, your fears. You become your fears. You don't see your happy parts. You become afraid of the white light. You become afraid of enlightenment. And because you become afraid of these things in Tibet, you're drawn toward your lower parts, your lower desires, your more unpleasing aspects. But the other part of the guardian of the threshold, and we talked about this a little bit already, is there is also the guardian also appears as a hierarchical entity of the rank of archangel, who teaches the lesson of conscience by means of projecting the double of the human personality, aspiring to the depth world. The latter conception of the guardian of the threshold and of the nature of the meeting with him is more complete and still more true. Right? The guardian of the threshold is not a moral bogey for bowling over the spiritual bourgeoisie, but rather our elder brother and servant of God, who helps us with infinite kindness and superhuman wisdom, although with perfect truthfulness. to advance from the surface to the depths. At least such is the evidence of the experience of 5 people of this century known to me. I don't know who those 5 people are besides him. The guardian of the threshold spoken of in the Hermetic tradition is the great judge, charged with preserving the equilibrium of that which is above and that which is below. The traditional iconography of the church represents him with a sword and balance. Guess who? Saint Michael. And we talked about this before. How Saint Michael is this figure, kind of not only a guardian over all Christianity, I would have to say, but in particular over Hermeticism. The sword is his vivifying and healing action, giving courage and humility to the soul which hungers and thirsts for the depths, and the balance in his action of presenting the precise account of what must be paid in order to have the right to go further. Right? And then he talks about what has to be paid, right? Paying your debts. Forgive us our sins, as we forgive those who sin against us. Right? Forgiving the sins of others. So he talks about the importance of giving alms, taking care of the poor, right? How that medieval tradition of, giving one's wealth to the houses of the poor is a great precedent that we should be following, right? The guardian of the threshold spoken of in the tradition is therefore the administrator of the justice of conscience, and at the same time the master of the school of conscience. His balance signifies the negative aspect of conscience, and his sword signifies the positive aspect of conscience, revelatory and healing aspect. One cannot dispense with the meeting with the guardian of the threshold when one wants to cross the threshold which separates the surface world from the depth world. It is through the door of conscience that one must enter. And intuition, which reveals the depth world, is nothing other than intelligence submitted to conscience, submitted from the point of view of being one with it. Right? And he warns us again, there is no esoteric or occult technique which is able to help us pass from the surface world to the depth world, other than the purely moral act of sacrificium intellectus, sacrifice of the intelligence to conscience. It is the recognition once and for all of the primacy of moral logic, its superiority to the formal logic of intelligence. Now this, you think you meet people, especially occultists or esotericists, who want to dazzle you with their intelligence. And you don't want to be judgmental, but that, and you can do that without developing morally. Developing morally is the task. Like I said before, without 3 steps of moral development, and you take one step in occult knowledge, you take more, you reverse that ratio, you're asking for trouble. And here he goes. Now we talk. Then he gets into probably that will be the last thing we talk about, I think, today. How do you develop this? And he says there is nothing of technique. Here all is art and grace. Now he compares the Christian path to the Buddhist path, for instance, in the Vedic path, which have to do with techniques. We don't have techniques. We have the principle of rhythm instead of technique. Right? What does that mean? The principle of rhythm and that of technique differ as biology differs from mechanics, or as a living organism from a machine. Then he says rhythm. Rhythm in prayer, he says, makes it, this is page 515, makes it pass from the psychological domain to that of life, from the domain of personal tendencies and moods to that of the fundamental and universal impulses of life itself. Speaking in occult terms, here it is a matter of carrying prayer over from the astral body to the etheric body. That is, of making prayer employ the language of life instead of the language of personal feelings and desires. And a little bit farther, he says, calm and rhythmic prayer does not take forces, does not tire, but gives forces to the person praying. And he gives the example of the narrator, author of the Way of the Pilgrim, who, he says the Jesus prayer how many thousands times a day, but gives him energy. And the other example that he gives is this: the secret weapon, the rosary. Now, and he says, he's like, what, the rosary? He's anticipating that, some very cool occultist people are going, rosary? He said, do not be scandalized, dear unknown friend, by the fact that you find yourself confronted with the rosary prayer and a hermetic meditation on the 18th arcanum of the tarot, the arcanum which teaches how to surmount eclipsed lunar intelligence. Esotericism is not a collection of extraordinary and unknown things, but rather it is above all a less ordinary and less known way of seeing ordinary and known things, and of seeing their profundity. And the rosary prayer, wholly exoteric and known to nausea even, as it is, reveals profound truths of spiritual life, including that of union of prayer of the soul and spiritual prayer. Right? Practical Humanicism is above all the desire and capacity to learn from everyone and everything, and not knowing better is its, and that knowing better is its coffin. And they should. I mean, here's this week's challenge. Try saying the rosary every day, and you'll note. I mean, I usually say the rosary every day. Sometimes I miss, but both days I miss, boy, I feel when I miss it. And even in the middle of the night when I wake up and go back to sleep, I'd say the rosary. It's vivifying. In fact, Robert Powell, a friend who translated Meditations on the Tarot, in a lecture, he had a few lectures published a long time ago as a pamphlet, The Most Holy Trinisophia. He's got a book called that, but it's not the same thing. In there, he talked a little bit about uniting the rosary prayer with the Rosicrucian path, which I know from my own experience. I mean, that's because biodynamic farming, what I do is basically a Rosicrucian path. It's alchemy. United to the rosary there's a deep complementarity there. So I recommend you try it. And then as he's talking about this knowing better business, and this is, he has mentioned this before, it's a cardinal sin of occultists to think that because they've collected all this esoteric data or trivia, that they're somehow better than other people. I told you about my acquaintance who didn't think the elements of the Eucharist would be consecrated unless his spiritual self was there. Incredible. But that's not the case, right? And that's what, and the knowing better is the eclipse, right? The conscience is eclipsed when you know better, when you think you know better, I should say, right? And he says that way the card of the 18th arcanum becomes that of magical mechanism working behind the surface of the state of intelligence, which aims at explaining movement by the immobile, life by the non-living, consciousness by the unconscious, morality by the amoral. Indeed, how has it happened to mankind that many of its intelligent representatives, even its leaders and directors, have come to see in the brain not the instrument of the but the producer of consciousness? In chemistry, not the instrument, but the producer of life. In the economic sphere, not the instrument, but the producer of culture. And it goes on. Right? And he even says, it is kind of an interesting way to put it, human intelligence has undergone the effects of what is no more nor no less than hoodoo magic. Its conscious motivating will is immobilized in the square of two antinomies, that of authority, autonomy, and that of affirmation, negation. In order to come out of this, it is either to retreat into the region of the subintelligent or advance into the region of the superintelligent. That is, either to retreat in the fashion of a crayfish in its pond, which is on the card, or to advance by surpassing it and rising above itself by means of leaping or flying, and not to build towers of Babel, or to bay plaintively or howl furiously in the way of the dog and the wolf. Right? And then later he mentions different thinkers who he's seen escape from the subjective imprisonment of intelligence. And here he mentions Schopenhauer, Dusan, or Don't Know, Vladimir Soloviev, Nicholas Berdyaev, to name only the well-known names, right? They did this. And it takes audacity. And this is the thing, it's interesting, is that our academic institutions don't encourage that. They don't encourage creativity. They encourage, and this is in the humanities, I'm not even talking about the sciences. They encourage, instead of being a philosopher, they encourage you to be an expert at the philosophy of somebody or of a period. I'm an Anglo-American philosopher specializing in Wittgenstein, right? That's dead. I mean, as much as it's nice to study Wittgenstein or whomever, that's dead, right? That's retreating. That's going backwards. That's the crayfish. How do we bring creative elan to the enterprise of philosophy? How do we bring creative elan to the enterprise of theology or Hermeticism? This is our task. This is our task. And then, and we talked about it already, so I don't want to get into it. When he talks about the two kinds of people he can't talk to: those who psychologize everything, and those who spiritualize everything. Impossible. But what he leaves us with, though, is a warning about the intelligence that no longer moves forward but backward. And I fear our culture is in that space right now. And he points to the crayfish. And he compares it, or contrasts it, with the symbol of St. John, the eagle. And he says, now the 18th arcanum of the tarot is that of the eagle and the scorpion, the arcanum of the replacement of the one by the other. And the scorpion is Scorpio, right? And St. John is you want to go with those are the two symbols for Scorpio, the eagle and the scorpion, right? And he says, do you want to choose the way of the eagle, which rises above antinomies, or the way of the crayfish, which retreats before them until arriving at complete absurdity? That is, at the scorpionic suicide of intelligence. This is the point. That is the message to the human will of the 18th major arcanum of the tarot. And I'll see you next time when we talk about the sun.